love Bob. Bob was probably one of the greatest things about all of Stranger Things. Also, Sean Astin, amazing. But one of the things that really stood out to me was when Bob was explaining to Will about his reaction to the clown, which, by the way, was definitely Pennywise, but that's another video at this point. But what Bob is telling Will to do in response to the idea of the Mind Flayer is like, just confront it. I'm not afraid of you. Really confronting it. And he really talked about the more he confronted his fears about the clown, the less anxious he was in response to it. Now, at the very core, that makes a lot of sense. The idea of if you approach a stimuli or a feared item, the more and more you respond to it, the more and more you are exposed to it, the less and less anxiety you are going to experience as a result of being around that object or being exposed to it fundamentally. Fun fact, that's called exposure therapy, and it's amazing. But one of the things that we run into, and kind of Will unfortunately also ran into in response to the Mind Flayer, is there are certain times and certain anxiety conditions, or, supernatural beasts and all, that the more and more you attune or give attention to a thought, like an intrusive thought, like an obsessive thought, the more and more you pay attention to that thought, the bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger it gets, like the Mind Flayer, and then it feels like it's taking over you. When we look at certain anxiety conditions, predominantly looking at OCD, this is a really, really big one, where the more and more you attune or pay attention to the intrusive thought and you respond to the thought, the bigger and bigger and bigger the power over you gets, because that attunement to the obsessive thought turns into a compulsion where you have to attune to the thought, where you have to pay attention to the thought, instead of the idea of recognizing, oh, that's a thought that I'm having. So whilst Bob was meaning so very, very well, that's a really great approach to exposure with different types of stimuli, external stimuli, clowns. We definitely do some of that in exposure therapy. But when we look at, well, what does exposure look like to intrusive, repetitive, obsessive thoughts? The last thing I really want to expose you to in it is in a way that will perpetuate more and more obsessions and intrusions. Oftentimes, particularly for people who have obsessive thinking or who have obsessive thoughts, what ends up happening is the more you pay attention or try to litigate with the thought, respond to it, tell it that it's a piece of crap, or try to convince it how wrong it is, view those types of obsessive thoughts or those types of intrusive thoughts as the biggest internet bully that exists, and it has an infinite pool of energy. There's not enough energy in this world for you to litigate with something that has an infinite pool of energy against you. It will always find a way to win its argument because it's an internet troll. Of course it's going to win. So whenever we look at responding to obsessive thoughts, the last thing we actually want to do is feed into it more by trying to convince it that it's wrong or trying to negotiate with it. Remember, we don't negotiate with terrorists in this household. And one of the biggest things is the more and more we try to prove the obsession or the obsession content wrong, the bigger and bigger and bigger the Mind Flayer will get. So the way that we actually do it is we remove the oxygen from the room, basically, where instead of on one side, instead of litigating with the intrusive thought or the obsession, trying to prove it wrong or trying to have a legal case or a legal argument with it, instead of doing that, or even trying to prevent it from happening, because nothing you do is going to prevent a random thought from happening in your head. And the more and more you avoid trying to think about that, the more it's going to pop into your head like a Mind Flayer. So one of the techniques that we do in therapy is something called a non-engagement response, or a NER. A NER, which I love the fact that we call it this, a NER is essentially a statement in a way that you can respond to the obsessive thought or the stimuli that's happening up here as a way to just call it out that it's just a thought. This is kind of what Bob was talking about, is trying to basically say to the clown, you're just a clown. I'm not scared of you, you're just a clown. Trying to extinguish the power and control that the clown, in this case the stimuli, had over him. That is what we would like to do in response to some of those intrusive thoughts, just to call it out and say, no, you're just a thought, or wow, that was a really creative thought that my brain popped in, or wow, that was like a really mean thought that my brain thought of just now. You call it out, not trying to litigate with it, or not trying to avoid yourself from having it in the first place. It is how we have a little bit more of a neutral response. It's how we have a little bit more of a neutral response to the intrusion. So then if we have the obsessive thought, respond to the intrusion with one of the nerves, and then go about your day. In the beginning, you may notice more and more and more and more and more attempts by the obsessive thought to keep thinking about me, I'm right here, I'm right here, I'm right here. Just constant, like the knock on the door. Knock, 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 knock. The more and more we attend to it, the more it's going to be like, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. But what we end up doing is if we just go, we open the door and go, hi, I hear you. I'm going to go back to watching TV now. That will basically piss off it. My goal is to always piss off your OCD or obsessive thinking, because sometimes, and this is where it gets really confusing for a lot of my patients who have different types of worry or different types of obsessive thinking or different types of anxiety disorder, they love to dance with each other. There are some thoughts and worries where we would want to litigate, we would want to have conversations and attune to it. There are some that we want to do exactly what Bob is talking about. It's like, I'm going to confront that stimuli more and more and more and just put a big old spotlight on it and see what happens. But for things a little bit like a Mind Flayer, we don't want to go onto the field and approach it directly and try to have a conversation with it. We want to go, okay, that really sounds like that's a Mind Flayer right there. Okie dokie. Let me go back to drawing.